The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Parliament Square as tourists began gathering for the daily changing of the guard ceremony. Among them stood Marcus Thompson, a 34-year-old construction worker from Birmingham who had driven down to London with a heavy heart and anger burning in his chest. The previous week had been the worst of his life. His small construction company had collapsed under mounting debts. His wife Sarah had left him after 15 years of marriage, and his teenage daughter Emma refused to speak to him. Marcus clutched a handmade flag attached to a thick wooden pole. The fabric bore crude lettering that spelled out his grievances against the government's economic policies, which he blamed for destroying small businesses like his. He had spent sleepless nights crafting angry letters to politicians that went unanswered, watching news reports that seemed to mock his struggles, and feeling increasingly invisible in a system that appeared designed to crush ordinary people. As the crowd thickened around the palace gates, Marcus felt his pulse quickened. The tourists with their cameras and excited chatter seemed to represent everything wrong with the world, people with money to waste on holidays, while hard-working folks like him lost everything. He watched a family from Japan taking selfies, laughing carelessly, and his jaw tightened. These people would never understand what it felt like to watch your life's work crumble while politicians lived in luxury. The royal guards began their ceremonial march, their red tunics pristine and their movements precise. To most onlookers, it was a display of tradition and pageantry. To Marcus, it represented everything he had come to despise about the establishment, the pomp and circumstance that continued while ordinary citizens suffered.
Ow.
He gripped his flagpole, tighter, feeling the rough wood against his calloused palms. The guard closest to him stood motionless, eyes fixed straight ahead beneath the iconic bearskin hat. His name was James Mitchell, 26-year-old from Yorkshire, who had joined the army to support his widowed mother and younger siblings. James had been standing guard for nearly 2 hours, his training allowing him to remain perfectly still despite the growing crowd and the weight of his ceremonial uniform. He was thinking about his girlfriend, Lucy's birthday next week, and wondering if he could get leave to visit home. Neither Marcus nor James knew that their lives were about to intersect. In a moment, that would change everything. The morning air grew heavy with tension as more protesters began filtering into the crowd, though none carried the same desperate fury that consumed Marcus. He had reached his breaking point, and the sight of the stoic guard representing a system he felt had abandoned him became the focus of all his rage and desperation. Marcus pushed through the crowd, his flag bouncing against shoulders and heads as people turned to glare at him. His mind raced with thoughts of injustice and abandonment. The government had promised support for small businesses during the economic downturn, but when Marcus applied for emergency loans, he was buried in paperwork and red tape until it was too late. His employees, men he had known for years, had looked at him with disappointment and worry when he couldn't pay their wages. The memory of Sarah packing her suitcase played repeatedly in his mind. "I can't watch you destroy yourself like this, Marcus," she had said, tears streaming down her face. "You've become someone I don't recognize." But how could she understand? She had a secure job at the hospital while his world fell apart. Everyone seemed to have abandoned ship when things got rough. As Marcus drew closer to the ceremonial line, his breathing became shallow and rapid. The tourists continued their chatter, completely oblivious to his presence or his pain. A group of American visitors were discussing their expensive hotel and dinner plans, their voices grating against his nerves like sandpaper. Meanwhile, he hadn't been able to afford a proper meal in days, surviving on cheap bread and instant coffee. James Mitchell maintained his position, though his peripheral vision caught the agitated movement in the crowd. Years of training had taught him to remain alert while appearing completely focused ahead. He noticed the man with the flag moving erratically, pushing past people with increasing urgency. Something felt different about this particular individual. There was a desperation in his movements that set James's instincts on edge. The crowd noise seemed to fade for Marcus as tunnel vision set in. His entire focus narrowed to the guard standing so perfectly still, representing everything he blamed for his misfortune. The pristine uniform, the unwavering stance, the symbol of a monarchy that lived in palaces while common people struggled to keep their homes. His grip on the flagpole shifted, and he felt the weight of it in his hands. Marcus's daughter, Emma, stopped answering his phone calls after the business failed. She was embarrassed, he knew, embarrassed to have a father who couldn't provide stability. The shame burned in his chest like acid. He had built that company from nothing, working 8-hour days, missing family events, sacrificing everything to create something lasting. And for what? To be discarded when the economy shifted? The final trigger came when Marcus overheard a well-dressed woman complaining about the crowds to her companion, mentioning how the common people were ruining her photography. The casual dismissal in her tone, the assumption that some people mattered more than others, sent Marcus over the edge. His vision blurred with rage as he raised the flagpole, no longer seeing James as a person, but as a symbol of everything that had wronged him. The flagpole whistled through the air as Marcus swung it with all the fury and desperation that had built up over months of loss and humiliation. Time seemed to slow as the wooden shaft arced toward James, who had only a split second to react. Years of military training kicked in instantly. Overriding the ceremonial requirements that normally kept him statue still, James pivoted on his heel, his body moving with practiced precision despite the heavy ceremonial uniform. The flagpole struck his shoulder instead of his head, the impact sending a sharp pain down his arm, but not the devastating blow Marcus had intended. The crowd around them erupted in gasps and screams as phones were raised to capture the unfolding chaos. Marcus stumbled forward from the momentum of his swing, his face contorted with rage and desperation. "This is for all of us you've forgotten," he shouted, his voice cracking with emotion.
"Oh, while you play dress up, real people are dying."
The words came out in a torrent of pain that had been building for months, each syllable carrying the weight of his collapsed dreams and broken family. James recovered quickly, his training taking over completely. Without hesitation, he dropped the ceremonial rifle he had been holding and moved to neutralize the threat. His hands found Marcus's shoulders, and with a swift, controlled movement, he brought the agitated man to the ground. The technique was designed to subdue without causing unnecessary harm, but Marcus's emotional state made him fight against the restraint. The crowd pressed backward, creating a circle around the confrontation. Children began crying as parents pulled them away from the scene. Tourist cameras flashed and recorded, capturing every moment of Marcus's breakdown and James's professional response. Security personnel were already moving through the crowd, but James had the situation under control within seconds. Marcus found himself face down on the cold cobblestones, James's knee pressed firmly against his back to keep him subdued. The fight went out of him as quickly as it had come, replaced by a crushing sense of emptiness and shame. The flagpole lay broken beside him, its crude message now scattered and meaningless on the ground. He could hear his own ragged breathing, mixed with the concerned voices of onlookers. For James, the incident was a textbook execution of his training. But something about the man beneath him felt different from typical agitators. There was no political rhetoric or organized agenda, just raw, desperate pain that reminded James of his own father during the factory closures back home. Despite the attack, James found himself feeling an unexpected sympathy for the broken man he held down. The weight of what he had done crashed over Marcus like a tidal wave. Not only had he failed to make his point, but he had likely made everything worse. The legal consequences would be severe, and any chance of rebuilding his relationship with Sarah and Emma had probably just evaporated. He had become exactly what everyone expected: another angry man who couldn't handle his problems responsibly. The police arrived within minutes, their radios crackling with urgent communications as they took control of the scene. Marcus offered no resistance as they lifted him from the ground and secured his hands behind his back with plastic zip ties. His legs felt weak beneath him, and the reality of what he had done began to sink in fully. The crowd of tourists maintained their distance, many still recording with their phones. Turning his moment of desperation into viral content, James stood at attention as his commanding officer approached, conducting a quick assessment of his condition. The shoulder where the flagpole had struck throbbed with a dull ache, but James reported that he was fit for duty. His years of service had prepared him for many scenarios, but something about this encounter felt different. As he watched Marcus being led away, couldn't shake the image of complete defeat in the man's eyes. Detective Sarah Reynolds took the initial statement from James. While paramedics examined his shoulder, she had seen dozens of similar incidents. Over her 15-year career, protesters will let their emotions override their judgment and ended up facing serious criminal charges. But as she listened to James describe the attack, she noted his unusual reluctance to press for the harshest possible charges. Marcus was transported to Westminster Police Station, where the booking process felt surreal and mechanical. His personal belongings were cataloged and stored, including his wallet containing a photograph of Emma at her school. Graduation, a happier time, when she had looked at him with pride instead of disappointment. The custody sergeant read him his rights in a monotone voice that seemed to come from another world in the holding cell. Marcus sat on the narrow bench and stared at the concrete walls. The adrenaline had completely drained from his system, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion that seemed to reach into his bones. Other inmates spoke quietly among themselves, but Marcus remained silent, playing the morning's events and wondering how his life had spiraled so far out of control. Meanwhile, James completed his shift and returned to the barracks, where his fellow guards wanted to hear every detail of the incident. The story would become legendary among the regiment how James had neutralized an attacker without breaking ceremonial protocol more than absolutely necessary. But James found himself thinking about the desperation he had heard in Marcus's voice, and the way the man had simply given up after being subdued. Back in Birmingham, Sarah Thompson received a phone call from the police informing her of Marcus's arrest. She had been expecting something like this ever since he had started making increasingly angry statements about the government and the economy. Their daughter Emma was at school, unaware that her father's breakdown had become national news. Knew she would have to explain to their daughter that the man who had once built her a treehouse and taught her to ride a bicycle had now attacked a stranger in a moment of complete despair. The incident would be replayed on news channels throughout the day, the commentators analyzing everything from security protocols to the mental health crisis affecting middle-aged men. But lost in the analysis would be the human story of a man who had simply reached the end of his ability to cope with loss and felt that violence was his only remaining voice. The courtroom was packed 3 weeks later as Marcus appeared before Judge Patricia Hartwell for his sentencing hearing. He had pleaded guilty to assault and public disorder charges, accepting responsibility for his actions, despite his lawyer's advice to fight the case. The weight he had lost during his time in custody was evident in his ill-fitting suit. Borrowed from a charity that helped defendants who couldn't afford proper court attire, James Mitchell sat in the witness section, having been called to provide a victim impact statement. He had spent considerable time thinking about what he would say, consulting with his girlfriend Lucy and his mother back home. The expected response would be to emphasize the severity of the attack and push for maximum penalties. But James found himself struggling with that approach. Marcus's family sat in the public gallery. Sarah had come despite their separation, and Emma had taken time off from her university studies to support her father. Both women looked exhausted by the ordeal and the media attention that had followed. Emma had been forced to deal with classmates who recognized her father from the viral videos, while Sarah had faced awkward conversations with colleagues at the hospital. The prosecution presented a straightforward case emphasizing the seriousness of attacking a ceremonial guard and the potential for inspiring copycat incidents. Video evidence from multiple phones showed the attack from various angles, leaving no doubt about Marcus's actions. The prosecutor painted a picture of a dangerous individual who had let personal problems justify violence against an innocent person performing his duty. Defense attorney Michael Chen presented a different narrative, focusing on Marcus's previously clean record and the series of devastating losses that had preceded his breakdown. Character witnesses testified about his years of community service, his reputation as a fair employer, and his devotion to his family. A psychiatrist explained how prolonged stress and multiple traumatic losses could lead to impulsive actions, completely out of character for an individual. When James was called to give his statement, the courtroom fell silent. He stood at the witness stand in his dress uniform, looking directly at Marcus as he spoke. The attack was serious and could have resulted in significant injury, he began, following the expected script. But then he paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. However, I want the court to know that I believe Mr. Thompson is not a dangerous individual, but rather someone who was overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control. His actions were wrong, but I don't believe they represent who he truly is as a person. The unexpected compassion in James's voice surprised everyone in the courtroom, including the judge. Marcus looked up at James with tears in his eyes, perhaps the first genuine emotion he had shown since the incident. The guard he had attacked was showing him more understanding than he had shown himself in months. James continued, I would ask the court to consider rehabilitation rather than purely punishment, as I believe Mr. Thompson can contribute positively to society if given proper support. Judge Hartwell listened carefully to all the testimony before announcing a recess to consider her decision. During the break, Marcus's lawyer explained that James's statement had significantly improved his chances of receiving a more lenient sentence. For the first time in months, Marcus felt a small flicker of hope that his life might not be completely over. Judge Hartwell returned to the courtroom after an hour of deliberation, her expression thoughtful as she reviewed her notes one final time. The packed courtroom held its collective breath as she prepared to deliver the sentence that would determine Marcus's future. She acknowledged the seriousness of the assault, but also recognized the unique circumstances and the compelling testimony from the victim himself. Mr. Thompson, she began, looking directly at Marcus, your actions were inexcusable and could have resulted in serious harm to an innocent person performing his duty. However, the court has heard compelling evidence about your character and the extraordinary circumstances that led to this incident. She sentenced him to 18 months in prison, suspended for 2 years, along with 200 hours of community service and mandatory counseling sessions. Marcus felt his knees weaken with relief as the sentence was announced. It meant he would avoid immediate imprisonment if he complied with all the conditions. Emma reached over the barrier to squeeze his shoulder, the first physical contact they had shared since before his business collapsed. Sarah nodded approvingly, seeing this as an opportunity for Marcus to rebuild himself rather than simply being punished. As the court session ended, James approached Marcus in the corridor outside. The two men faced each other awkwardly, unsure how to navigate this unprecedented situation. I want you to know that I don't harbor any anger toward you, James said quietly. I hope you can get the help you need and find a way forward. Marcus struggled to find words, finally managing a simple thank you that carried the weight of genuine gratitude. 6 months later, Marcus was halfway through his community service at a local homeless shelter where his construction skills had proven invaluable in maintaining the building and teaching job skills to residents. The work had given him perspective on his own problems while allowing him to help others facing similar struggles. The mandatory counseling sessions had helped him develop better coping strategies and understand how his pride had prevented him from seeking help earlier. His relationship with Emma had slowly begun to heal through regular phone calls and weekend visits. She had initially been angry and embarrassed, but seeing her father take responsibility and work toward improvement had restored some of her respect for him. Sarah had agreed to attend joint counseling sessions, exploring whether their marriage could be salvaged or if they could at least maintain an amicable relationship. James continued his service with the Royal Guard, and the incident had made him something of a legend within the regiment. More importantly, it had deepened his understanding of the challenges facing ordinary citizens and inspired him to volunteer with veteran support organizations during his off-duty time. He had learned that sometimes showing mercy could be more powerful than demanding justice. The viral videos of the incident continued to circulate online, but the story had evolved beyond the initial moment of violence. Media outlets followed up with reports about Marcus's rehabilitation and James's compassionate response, turning it into a story about redemption rather than just conflict. Marcus had learned that rock bottom could be a foundation to build upon, while James had discovered that sometimes the greatest strength lies in forgiveness and understanding. Both men had been forever changed by those few seconds of violence, but in ways neither could have anticipated. What began as Marcus's worst moment had become the catalyst for rebuilding his life with honesty and humility. While James's measured response had demonstrated the power of compassion in the face of adversity, their unlikely encounter had taught them both valuable lessons about human resilience and the possibility of finding hope even in the darkest moments.